Recognized, Uncle Walker, D01. Recognized, One Shot, D09. Initiate Part 1.
As usual, Jade, you're missing the point. Artemis's death is an insult to our professional reputations. The son of Black Manta cannot kill Sportsmaster's daughter, not without running it by me first.
Hello, heroes. Today in the cave, we have none other than James D'Amato, host and game master of the One Shot Podcast and co-founder of the One Shot Podcast Network. James is nothing short of a hero to me, having co-created a network that has become one of, if not the, ambassadorial flagships for the gaming industry. One Shot brings together improvisational actors from the legendary Chicago acting scene and gaming industry professionals to share some of the industry's best systems, stories, and experiences. James, it is an honor to welcome you to the cave.
Rich, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you, and I have to say I am deeply whelmed by that introduction.
Fantastic. That's my goal. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series, both seasons so far, I should say, the comics, and the video game. If you have not seen, read, or played all of the material and are spoiler wary, consider this your warning. And with all that, let's dive in. James, I touched on a few things in the intro, but tell us a little more about you and what you do in the world.
Well, you actually gave a great introduction to the things that I do. People primarily know me from the One Shot Podcast Network. It is a collection of RPG podcasts spanning actual play, interviews, and discussion. I host the One Shot Podcast, where every month we investigate a new role-playing system with a rotating cast of improvisers, game designers, and other notable nerds from around different geeky industries. It's a lot of fun, and I love doing the show just so very much, and it's provided me all sorts of great opportunities, like the ability to come on Whelmed and talk about one of the best animated superhero series of all time.
Of all time. Thank you, sir. So speaking of that, we have a few questions we start with our discussion sessions, which is, when did you first see Young Justice? Did you stream it, binge it when it was on Netflix, or did you happen to catch it when it was originally airing?
This is one of the few times in my life where I get to tap into my nerd cred. I saw this as it was originally airing.
Nice.
Kat and I were living together at the time, and we would get up. I think originally it was in a reasonable time slot, but there was a period where we had to get up at 7 a.m. on Saturdays to catch it.
Yeah, it was terrible. I was watching it too, but I don't have cable, so I had purchased it on iTunes and just was waiting for the new episodes to come out. And we talk about the ridiculous release schedule.
Man, it was brutal.
Terrible.
Yes, from a sheer storytelling and animation quality perspective, it's amazing that Young Justice was canceled because it was such an incredible show. But based on the way it was handled, both the merchandising and the time slots that it was put in, especially because it was telling an ongoing story, they didn't give it a chance.
No. 6-month hiatus followed by a 3.5-month hiatus.
Yeah, how are you supposed to keep kids interested in that?
Yeah, I don't know. Or anyone. Period. And there was so much delay that the season finale of season 1 was followed the following week by the season premiere of season 2, because they delayed season 1 so much, which was the only positive part of any of those delays. Anyway, so what was your experience with DC or comics in general before you watched the series?
I was a big old nerd.
Nice. Was?
At that point in my life, I think I was more dialed in than I am now. I have much less time to stay current on comics these days, just because I'm doing so much work, producing podcasts and whatnot.
Yeah.
I still have a very tight collection of indie books that I read, but my pull list at my comic shop was probably putting me well over $200 a month in books that I was purchasing.
I'm feeling you.
So I was very deeply dialed in to DC at that time. Generally speaking, I am a Marvel person. Spider-Man is my favorite hero. Though tied for place 2, Batman and Superman are together and locked in an eternal knot. So I have I've got a lot of love for DC. And Kat is a huge fan of DC. So she and I would spend a lot of time watching through their animation catalog, and our roommate Sam was also really into it. And we were feeling a deep angst about the New 52 reboot that was going on at the time. And Young Justice was the gleaming beacon in the DC universe at that time. It was the best thing they were producing. DC's animation has always been great, but this was like the perfect revision of the universe. If they were going to relaunch the universe, why not just have it be Young Justice? It was so good.
Absolutely. You're not going to get any arguments from either Caleb or me, I don't think. Yeah, and the fact that they gave Young Justice one of the 52 new worlds was kind of nice.
Yeah.
But I would have liked to have seen it, so much more influenced in the regular DC universe. Just the whole idea and concept of the big picture storytelling that they were doing. You got to pull that in to the multiple titles that 52 was trying to juggle and deal with at the time. Yeah,
absolutely.
So with the, I dare say, hundreds, thousands of different role-playing game systems you've played at this point?
Well, I've probably closer to hundreds.
A mere 3 digits. Yeah.
Like, publicly, probably only played about 100 games. Privately, I'm like working on 200.
Yeah.
But I've certainly read a lot more.
Right. I bet your shelf is packed full of to-be playeds.
But yeah, so I believe the question was going to be about RPG role-playing systems.
Yes.
Comic book RPGs, right?
Actually, just superhero RPGs in general. I'm trying to remember. I've listened to a lot of One Shot, but I'm sure I've missed a few episodes here and there. Have you guys covered any superhero RPGs or stories, or what's your experience?
We actually have not done that much superhero stuff on One Shot. One of the reasons Kat and I, and like this is sort of, I mean, it's not really not public information. We just haven't heavily invested our time in it yet. Kat and I are working on our own superhero role-playing system.
Oh, really? You've heard it here first on Whelmed.
That's a scoop. Yeah,
Scoop.
I actually don't know if we've dropped that little tidbit anywhere else. But yeah, we're working on a role-playing system called Alter Ego.
I already love it. What a great title.
It's a perfect title. We could not believe that it wasn't taken. That's one of the reasons that I feel comfortable saying it on this show, just so that's ours, baby. And we are going to be doing a huge bout of research going into this project. We want to play almost every superhero game available on the market. There are some that I know that we can skip over, but I think really every design has inherent value to it. And we just haven't put it on One Shot yet because we want all of those details to be really fresh in mind when we tackle our superhero project.
Very nice. Yeah.
But I do know about a lot of them, and we are actually going to have a superhero system coming up on a episode of One Shot in January that was actually inspired by Young Justice.
Oh,
and
really?
That is Masks.
Oh, Matt, we've talked about Masks before in the show. Like, we had Steve Kenson on just a few weeks ago, or I recorded with him a few weeks ago, and he was also pitching Masks as like such the almost unofficial Young Justice.
It really is. Obviously, it was deeply inspired by Young Justice, Teen Titans, X-Men, any of those sort of team-based teen superhero stories, and it does its job beautifully. I highly recommend anybody who enjoys Young Justice, whether you're curious about role-playing or you're a deep role player already, Masks is something to consider. I'm partial to it because I like apocalypse-powered systems, which is a indie, more lighter rules variant than most people typically play as their first game. I think it's really innovative and really cool. However, there are a ton of great superhero systems out there. I would also recommend people check out Mutant City Blues using Robin Law's Gumshoe system.
Oh,
if you like
yeah.
a more investigative approach to RPGs, I think like especially season 2 of Young Justice, there's a lot of heady investigation and sort of espionage elements to what's going on, and Mutant City Blues does a great job of handling that and letting you explore that space very freely.
That's fantastic. I haven't actually heard of that. I know Gumshoe. I haven't gotten a chance to play it yet. I've heard it's fantastic.
Gumshoe is very good. The combat is not super technical, though I will say of all the offerings that is out there for superhero or for Gumshoe RPGs, Mutant City Blues does its job to really try and cultivate that high action, high intensity sort of feeling that you would expect from a superhero setting.
Yeah. Wow, that's fantastic. So I was first sent to the One Shot podcast when I mentioned to a friend how disappointed I was in actual play podcasts. I'm a huge fan of old-time radio dramas like The Shadow, and I've, of course, been a gamer since the 70s, so I was really looking for something specific, I think, when I was, or had high expectations, I don't know, of actual plays. When I first started listening to them or trying them, and that friend immediately sent me to the Legend of the Five Rings series that you did on One Shot, run by the amazing Jim McClure.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of bringing professional actors and game designers together to present these mashups of like improv show, radio drama, role-playing games just blew my mind. Can you talk a little bit about like we know a lot some about the gaming history that you have, but what about the improv scene? Like how'd you get plugged into that, and how did the idea for the podcast come up? And then we'll dive into some Young Justice here.
Of course. Well, the improv scene, I decided to move out to Chicago after college after doing an improv intensive at Second City the summer before graduation. I was sort of in a weird place in my life because I had for a long time, I think since freshman year of high school, imagined that I would grow up and be a stand-up comedian. Because that was like, I knew I wanted to be a comedian, and that was my only like entry point that I knew into comedy, because it's the sort of thing where you develop those skills yourself and you work on everything yourself. So it's not like a thing where there's an institution that can get in your way and stop you. But I sort of took a look at some of the older comedians around me and realized that not a lot of the stand-ups that I was hanging out with in these clubs, like none of them were really friends with each other, and they all seemed very sad inside.
Yikes.
So
Yikes.
I was like, is this really the life that I want for myself? And I decided to explore my other comedy options. And I went to Chicago to try out at Second City. And I just found that, man, this feeling that I'm getting from improv, the collaborative creation, is really transcendent. It's something completely different than I had been experiencing in the stand-up world, and it was so similar to my experiences at the role-playing table that I felt it was worth it for me to take at least a couple years and really investigate this and see where it would make me end up. Now, we talk about my origins with a podcast. I took those 2 years, or those like 3-ish years. I learned the improv craft, and I found out that, well, I really liked doing improv, and I valued the skills that I got from improv. The theater system was not for me. And I was sort of like running out of options, but I had a podcast with my buddy where we just did improv called The Overshare.
Oh, yes.
And I really liked podcasting. And I liked podcasting because something that I controlled, like completely. There was no way that I had to go on anybody else's authority to determine what was on the show. It was something that like we could completely control ourselves. Nobody could stop us from doing it. And Pat O'Rourke came to me and said he had been listening to a show on the Earwolf Network called Nerd Poker. And Nerd Poker had comedians playing Dungeons and Dragons. I think it was like 2nd edition and 4th edition. And I listened to it, and I was like...
Okay, that's quite a combo.
They started out in 2nd edition, and then they moved to 4th edition. And it was stand-up comedians. I think that's Brian Posehn's like podcast. And what I felt when listening to it is that, this is a great idea, having these funny people do it, but they're not really giving it their all. They're not like committing as hard as they could. And it's funny that you mentioned that you grew up listening to The Shadow, because I grew up listening to The Green Hornet as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
That old
exactly.
radio serial, and also the Superman radio serials. So I had this background in listening to and loving radio dramas. And I was like, well, here's my opportunity to make something that is similar to those radio dramas and use the skills that I have from improv. And like, I can play around in all of these different fictional worlds. And instead of just sticking with D&D, I wanted to try a bunch of different role-playing systems, because I knew that there's more out there than just D&D, and that D&D, while a great game, is probably not the best thing to listen to on the sidelines. So we started One Shot. And, years later, like 3 years later exactly, it is a pretty big success. And it has given me the opportunity to really use all of the skills that I've developed in my life. Like, I really don't think I could do it if I had left out any of the experiences I had in stand-up, in improv, going through theater systems, reading comics, playing role-playing games. Like, it all came together in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can tell, like, the quality of the sounds. Like, I could go off and on and on and on about One Shot. We'll talk about some examples of some episodes that people can listen to if you're a fan of Young Justice a little bit later. But speaking of the Young Justice, so this improv and the voice acting that you have to do for the podcast has to give you an interesting insight when you're watching an animated series like Young Justice, or I know Spectacular Spider-Man, another Greg Weisman show, is a big show for you as well.
Absolutely.
Like, what are your thoughts on how do you pull apart like the voice acting and the dialogue in a show like this? The actors are fantastic, but I'm interested to see, like, what do you think?
So I think a lot of different voice actors will approach different iconic roles. And, I feel like every male voice actor maybe has in their back pocket, like, oh, I could do the Joker if I got an opportunity.
I've heard your Joker. It's quite good.
So, it's the sort of thing where for the most part, I am completely enraptured by someone's performance. I really only notice a performance when I'd go, oh man, I would have done that differently. Or I wonder how they arrived there. It's only in retrospect, like after a work is complete, that I'll go back and like invest time in dissecting voices that I really, really liked. Like in Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series, I really, really loved those voice actors, and they influenced me quite a bit. And in the years since, I've sort of like gone back and go, how are they approaching the character? What vocal patterns are they imposing on it? And how has that informed the overall piece? Young Justice, for the most part, I'm going to say 90% of the voices there are amazing, and they really played into that overall piece. Well, Young Justice is, in my opinion, one of the best animated series that DC has done. I also don't think that it's perfect, and there are some areas, and it's not, I won't say in the voice acting performances, I think it's in some of the story pacing and some of the character choices that they made that, like, I sit there crossing my arms as like a couch casting director and going, I could do better than that. That's probably not true, but like, whenever you sort of relate yourself to a certain art form, you get opinions about it, whether they're founded or not.
Yeah. It's as if I started a podcast to talk about my opinions from the couch. Yeah. Yeah. Any episode where we have a canary debrief about the storytelling breakdowns. So one of the things I wanted to mention too, like, it's not just the voice acting of individual, like a voice actor to a character. In this case, you have characters like, the voice actor for Superboy is the same voice actor for Superman. And as someone who doesn't, I have a pretty good ear for voices. It took me a little while to realize that it's the same actor, which makes sense from a writing standpoint that, of course, Superboy being a clone of Superman would have the same voice, but just younger, right? Of course, it makes sense. But it didn't occur to me because there is such a difference in how this voice actor presents these two voices. I'm incredibly impressed. And then also, that pulls over into Roy as well, who's Guardian and Speedy and Red Arrow and all these other characters as well, right? How do you look at that? How do you break that down? Like, how do you go through a process of creating a voice like that?
So it's really interesting. I think the most impressive example, to me, is not at all related to Young Justice, but it's in the Clone Wars. Watching the voice actor for those clones work to create dozens of individual and unique characters using what is essentially the same voice.
Just real quick, for those of our listeners who don't maybe know what we're referring to, I know we're using a little bit of lingo here. Clone Wars is the Star Wars Clone Wars 6-season animated series that they put out that takes place between episode 2 and episode 3, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So fantastic. And that's a great point too. How many clones? How many main clones? There's at least 6 to 10 main characters.
Yeah, so I think there are about 6 to 10 main clones,
but there's so many others as well that come and go.
And that's all D. Bradley Baker. So he's presented with this challenge of he has to voice these characters who have the same body but different personalities, and make them distinct from one another.
Right.
And if you're just listening to an episode, you can tell which clone is talking just based on who they are and what their personality is, that was granted to them by this voice actor. And I think voice acting is one of those really special performance types where an actor is really able and challenged to engage their full range. There are a bunch of good voice acting documentaries floating around, and you realize how prolific and how diverse some of the more famous voice actors that we're familiar with across a lot of media are. And I think that sort of performance is really well summed up in performances like D. Bradley Baker's, or I can't remember who does Superboy and who does Roy on the show.
Nolan North is the guy who does the voice for Superboy, and Crispin Freeman does the voice of Roy and all of the incarnations.
Yeah, I think there are two major challenges in voice acting, and one is making characters who are incredibly similar for whatever reason sound different, and the other is to have one character do an impression of another character.
Oh, you know what I'm thinking of? In Justice League Unlimited, in the last season, they had Flash and Lex Luthor switch bodies. Do you remember that?
I loved that episode.
Right?
Yes.
So you have Clancy Brown trying to do, in the body of Lex Luthor, trying to do the voice of Flash's humor. It's fantastic.
It's so good. Oh, God, that episode is so fantastic.
One of my favorite lines, aren't you going to wash your hands? No, because I'm evil. It's such a great episode. Yeah, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's just like a classic example, I think, of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that's great about Young Justice as a show is it's willing to engage challenges like that for voice actors. Like that I think a lot of shows would shy away from having clones of a character on the show, or, have the same actor play a generation apart, essentially themselves physically.
This sounds weird, but it just occurred to me that we're talking almost entirely about clones across the board. Superboy, Superman, all the clones of Roy, and then all the clones in the Clone Wars. I guess it's a perfect example of how to do this, or where it comes up.
It's such a, it's a neat narrative problem, and they gave us, there are 2 instances of clones so far on this show.
Right. What's interesting, though, too, is, and Caleb and I have discussed this, is they use it in the narrative to give hints to things as well, because in the very first 2-part premiere, you have Crispin Freeman voicing Guardian. And at the very end of that first episode, Double X refers to Guardian as brother, which is the same thing he's been calling Superboy that whole 2 episodes.
Oh, wow.
So when at the very end, he said, "I'm with you, brother," right? So when you go back and rewatch it a few times and you start to understand after you've seen the second season, because we didn't know the first season, you see the second season, you realize that Guardian was actually a Roy clone as well. Double X's plant of the fact that Guardian was a clone in the very first episode shows such forethought in the writing, not just a tossback, oh, we should make this because that's interesting. We had Crispin do that voice. No, it was already written clearly into that episode.
It's definitely one of those shows that's written with intense and careful attention and intent. And it shows through, not just in the writing and the overall story arc as you go back and rewatch and go, aha, I'm seeing that clue that is obvious now in the retrospect of the story that I've been told. But it's baked into the performances. They did their casting really well, and they handed their actors these tremendous challenges that they took on, and I think succeeded really incredibly.
Yeah. And for yourself as a storyteller and, dare I say, professional game master, I know you analyze and pull inspiration just like I do and Caleb does from every TV show, movie, book you're exposed to. But I wanted to have you on the show because you and I behind the scenes have been chatting a little bit about the villains in Young Justice and how they're handled. And I think this might echo back to a comment you made a little while ago about how certain villains are just flat out genius and others were handled either oddly or I don't know how to describe it, but I think we should dive into that a little bit for our listeners. So I've listed a few of the key villains that I found fascinating from one extreme or another, like Luther, Sportsmaster, who I've already talked about a little bit, who's going to get his own episode with us. But then the other ones we haven't really mentioned yet because they haven't come up in episodes that we've reviewed yet, like Riddler, Joker, and some of the others that, I don't know, what do you think? Missed the mark or didn't quite, were handled in such an odd way? Dive into that.
One of the things that I say about Young Justice is, with the exception so far of Lex Luthor, all of the A-level villains that are featured in Young Justice have had sort of lackluster appearances, and the D-level villains are fantastic reinventions of themselves.
No joke.
Like, there's no way, if you went to me 10 years ago and said Sportsmaster is going to be one of your favorite villains of all time, I would have said, you're insane. Leave this place now.
Totally insane. The world has collapsed. Yeah, no way.
But I think part of the problem stems from when you look at a character like the Joker and a character like the Riddler, they are such an iconic and important part of the Batman mythos, which has been explored repeatedly for decades.
Exhaustively.
I mean, you have Batman the Animated Series depictions and everything that we're seeing, not just in comics, or not just in television, but in comics, in movies, is really partially a response to those depictions that we saw in the animated series.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so when you're a creator, when you're a writer working in the shadow of those depictions, like working in the shadow of Mark Hamill's Joker, I think the instinct to reinvent the character and, you know, give your hot take and go, this is what I think the Joker's going to be like. And while it's really good for us to see diverse interpretations of these characters, because, you know, as comic book characters, they are myth. They are characters that are meant to be looked at from thousands of different angles and to speak with thousands of voices while keeping to a certain core theme. When you have a reinvention like Young Justice, it's sort of disappointing to see an amazingly iconic Sportsmaster coming into play, and then looking at the Joker and the Riddler and knowing the potential they have as characters, and then seeing a reinvention that's new and interesting, but doesn't really hold a candle to the iconic interpretations that you've seen before. And as a writer, that would intimidate me a great deal, because I know what I would want to say about a character like the Joker or the Riddler, but I will say that it's deeply informed by writers who have come before me. And I think it would be another Joker or another Riddler story rather than a fresh new take.
Yeah.
So you're rolling the dice when you create these new interpretations of characters. And I think on Sportsmaster, you know, it comes up a critical success. And on the Joker and Riddler, like, you know, I love the Riddler as a character, but his Young Justice version frustrates me to no end.
Yeah, and I have a few theories about that too. In watching the show, I don't know, I want to just say 52 times, because why not? Because of the fact that, I mean, as huge a Batman, I mean, I was watching the Batman TV show from the 60s so much that my brother and sister were going to murder me. And, you know, you have someone like Cesar Romero back then doing his version of the Joker. That was the classic, that was the Mark Hamill of the day. You know what I mean? Like, every interpretation of him after that was based almost entirely on that show. And then you look at Batman the Animated Series, who, I mean, I know a lot of the people that I talk to in the gaming industry are a little bit younger than I. Not all of them, but most of them. But I remember watching Batman the Animated Series, stumbling on it as I was channel surfing, because back in the 90s, there was no hype for this at this level for anything. No internet to know that this was even happening. So the first time I saw their interpretation of Mr. Freeze is a horrifying and heartbreakingly, like, relatable villain. I'm like, what are you smoking? How did you come up with this? And Sportsmaster to me is just like that. Like, the first scene with him in it, I'm like, who's the you know, the Mike Myers wannabe with the hockey? Oh my God, that's Sportsmaster?
Sportsmaster.
What? And then having Aqualad kind of like, oh no, like have this tone in his voice, like it's Sportsmaster. And I'm like, I am in an alternate dimension right now. And then have him spot Miss Martian and throw a javelin, which misses her, but he knew that because it has a proximity detector and then blew up anyway. And I'm like, he's all, thanks for the workout, Superboy, but I gotta go. I'm like, what is happening right now?
Sportsmaster, such a brilliant success as a villain. He carries himself in that show with an air of dignity and authority that has not been afforded to him by any of his past appearances.
In 70 years? Yeah, I don't even know.
And I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of also sense of humor to make a character like Sportsmaster and go, okay, we exist in a DC universe with Deathstroke the Terminator.
Right.
And we're going to make Sportsmaster take over that role.
Yeah, Sportsmaster, and to have any scene like in season 2 when Deathstroke shows up, when Slade shows up, to have any writing that makes me think, oh God, Sportsmaster can go toe to toe with Slade.
Come
exactly.
On. Especially
right?
Slade Wilson spent all of the Teen Titans animated series getting hyped up to a crazy degree. I think Slade Wilson saw in the Teen Titans series what we're seeing with Sportsmaster in Young Justice. It's just, This is a character that I didn't really think about beforehand. Yeah, he was a problem for the Teen Titans, so he spent a long time annoying teenagers, and now he's like this mythically competent figure that's on par with Batman, and I'm seeing that now with a character named Sportsmaster,
right?
With somebody who has a highlight glove sometimes just strapped to his wrist.
Some of our listeners only have experienced Deathstroke through Young Justice, or maybe through the Arrow live action TV show. But in the comics, to me, Deathstroke was, in the comics, his photographic reflexes and his thought process, the way he strategizes and his tactics were like Captain America, Batman level thinking. That there's a great, I wish I could remember the issue, but it's him having prepared, but him going toe to toe with the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern, Wally West Flash, Wonder Woman, and somebody else, and he puts them all down. Whoever wrote, I suspect it was Mark Waid, because he's such a genius writer. But in whatever you did, you were watching this, and you were absolutely believing that he would take down a lantern, know? And then, so that's my impression in my head of him, and then have him be on the show and think, yeah, Sportsmaster, man, I think he could go toe to toe with him. Just nuts.
My favorite line from Sportsmaster in all of Young Justice that really sums up the humor and reverence and seriousness that they approached Sportsmaster with is him saying, the son of Black Manta cannot kill the daughter of Sportsmaster. It's just, he has granted himself such dignity in that moment. It's such a regal, badass thing to say.
Yeah.
And it that puts him at a top tier of villains that there's no way he would have gotten this opportunity any other way. If somebody had put together a Sportsmaster solo ongoing series, it would have failed simply because of the character's name.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet, here's this show, and what it did with him is just so incredible.
Absolutely. And the Luthor, now as kind of a counterpoint almost in a different direction from, say, Joker and Sportsmaster, this Luthor is exactly the Luthor from the comics that I have always wanted to see. Clancy Brown as Luthor in Superman was great. I loved him there. What a great use of a unique voice for Luthor. But he had that businessman appeal, that very first premiere of the Superman animated series, where Superman is floating outside Lex's office window, and Lex is in the office just staring him down, and them having a conversation, a dialogue about what the future was going to hold for both of them in their relationship was a brilliant scene. But this Luthor, particularly, and I don't like getting too negative on the show, but the Batman versus Superman Luthor, that was nowhere near any Luthor of mine. This Luthor, who's in so few scenes and owns every single scene he's in, and then maneuvers himself to become the head of the UN
Yeah.
by the end of season 2 by saving the world. It's like, yes, please, more of that Luthor.
What I see in that is this is not them going for a hot take on Lex Luthor. I see so many similarities between the Young Justice Lex Luthor and the Clancy Brown Luthor of the Superman animated series, down to Mercy being his bodyguard,
Exactly.
down to Mercy getting a second shot at being a primary character who the 90s denied her becoming like official DC canon across the board. Hopefully we'll get more of that with the return of Young Justice, but this is Lex Luthor. This is one of the great things about the Superman animated series is it was such a statement on Superman, such an iconic Superman that they were presenting you. They were drawing on all these different angles to create it, and I really feel that the Young Justice Lex Luthor is a refinement of that. They've taken the mad scientist angle and like amped that up even more. So you have full-on businessman Lex Luthor, but he's also charming. Like in a lot of Lex Luthor depictions, you cannot understand how anybody would trust him, like how he has any authority in society, anybody going, you are just a criminal, please leave me alone.
Right, yeah.
But you have this Lex Luthor who's cool and confident, and to like, he brings Arsenal that arm and he offers him a deal, and it's like, yeah, he's going to take that deal because that was presented in a perfect way.
Exactly. And in Darcy Ross' interview, when she came on the show to talk to us as well about like being a new fan of DC in general, this is some of her first experience with these characters. She was like, Lex Luthor, all he's doing the whole show is giving everybody what they want.
Yeah.
The entire show. You cannot turn him down because all he's doing is giving you what you want. Like, it's genius. And just the whole thing at the end of season 1 on Santa Prisca, where he's all, son, if you wish to detain me, see my lawyer. And then he just walks away from like every superhero. There's no powers. There's no 80s power suits. You know, there's no, craziness like he has to be Iron Man going toe-to-toe physically with Superman. He needs none of it. And we love and hate him. As another friend of mine says, I want to be impressed by Lex, and I want to be kind of turned on by Lex. Right? And if you don't have those things, the intellectual, if you just don't have that, it's not Lex to me. That's that core you're talking about. I think it's a great point you made about the great thing about comics is this mythology, right? That you can retake. You can take Batman and put him in the 40s. We'll get to that.
Right.
We'll get to that in a few minutes, Mister. The game you ran. But you can take him and put him in the 40s. You can take him and do Gotham by Gaslight, which is a great miniseries, right? You can take him and have him fight Cthulhu. None of those things are core to the standard DC mythos, but they are core to the character because you keep that character, that heart of that character, and move forward. And I think people have a hard time understanding who Luthor is supposed to be because we get, as brilliant as Kevin Spacey is and did a great job with that Luthor as he was presented, that Luthor was not really written very well, right? It's not this Luthor. People have a hard time finding the heart. Batman doesn't kill, right? And he doesn't like guns, and he was an orphan. Those basic things, but people have a hard time for some reason finding that heart of Luthor, and some of these others as well.
Yeah, I really do think that you need to be able to distill those characters down into like a few essential statements. And for Lex Luthor, I feel like there have been depictions of him that have stated them before, but everybody's got to have a goddamn hot take. It's like Lex Luthor hates Superman and thinks highly of himself.
Yeah.
And he's selfish. He's conceited and selfish and hates Superman. That's all you need, but people got to go ahead and Jesse Eisenberg it and like come up with some nonsense personality that's not charming or like endearing in any way. And
right.
I will say, I will cheer them on and say, please continue assaulting us with new hot takes on these characters. Please come up with a new voice for them. But It's not going to hit him out of the park all the time.
Right.
And
That's
the
fair.
only time that it bothers me is when it's in a show like Young Justice, where you have so many notes that are hit pitch perfect, to have others fail that mark. It's just like, oh, we could have had everything, but
Yeah.
I guess art is fallible.
I guess. And so here's part of my theory about like characters like the Joker and the Riddler is the idea that they are done so much. And Joker was just kind of a miss, but Riddler was clearly written to be an entirely different kind of Riddler. I love Brent Spiner. I think he's great. This take was a weird, like, Deadpool breaking the fourth wall, talking to himself in weird pacing of dialogue. I just didn't like it.
I mean, one thing that has been made clear to me in the series is that we're going to be seeing more of this Riddler. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's only had the second season. So it's that sort of thing where I'm not instantly warm to this Riddler in the way that I was instantly warm to Lex, the way that like I was instantly won over by Sportsmaster, but they clearly are going to be investing in this Riddler. And
Yeah.
we need to see how it plays out. But right now, I've got some reservations. I'm not fully on board yet.
No, I hear you. I don't disagree with you. I have to fall back, though, on something that like Darcy said, too, this idea that everything that I felt about characters, particularly early in the first season, were exactly how the writers wanted me to feel. Like Miss Martian, why am I so annoyed that she is a ditzy teenage stereotype of a girl? Oh, it's because she's a ditzy stereotype of a girl from a TV show. So like I'm hoping the Riddler does something else, but I'm okay with it. Riddler gets a lot of airtime. I want it to be better because you're right, the background is so beautiful in which he's placed and so oddly offbeat with the show.
And Riddler is one of my favorite villains who never gets any play. Like nobody respects the Riddler. They always treat him like a low-rent Joker, and he's so much more than that.
Oh, interesting. I want you to unpack that, mister.
So I'd say since Jim Carrey's interpretation of the Riddler, which was a play on the Batman 66 Riddler.
Yep.
Like, the Batman 66 Riddler is an inspiration for Mark Hamill and Jack Nicholson's Joker more so than almost anything else. More so than even Cesar Romero.
Yeah.
If, like, you look at the way those characters behave, they are modeled after the Riddler. So the really interesting and cool things that came out of the Riddler from 66 got transferred to the Joker, which has left a lot of writers scratching their heads as to how do I approach this character now? And a lot of the time the Riddler shows up, I feel, in stories, and I can't justify this because I haven't spoken to the writers, I haven't spoken to the editors, but I feel like, oh, you're using the Riddler because you couldn't get the Joker for your story. And like the exceptions to that are Hush, which I don't think was a very well done story, and it kind of annoyed me because the premise of Riddler knowing Batman's identity is just delightful. And that brief stint, I think before the New 52 reboot, where the Riddler was a private detective.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I don't know that one.
When Batman was quote unquote dead from Grant Morrison's run, they did this like year gap, and then we rejoined the city, and everybody was sort of acting different. In Gotham City Sirens, we had Catwoman and Ivy and Harley living together and sort of like acting as not quite heroes, but not really quite the villains they were before. And you had the Riddler, who started up a private detective firm.
That's actually that's a drop of genius right there, actually.
It's brilliant because like the only thing that he wants to prove is that he's smarter than Batman.
Exactly.
And if Batman is not around to directly challenge, it's like, well, I guess I have to become a better detective than Batman was.
I love that.
A few of the stories that they wrote for that were absolute genius, and like there were some writers who clearly didn't get it and weren't on board with it. Like there was one story that really annoyed me of like Detective Chimp dissing the Riddler, and I'm like, just let the Riddler be good at this. Let the Riddler be good. Stop dissing the Riddler. So I come to Young Justice, which treats so many characters with reverence and respect, and we have a Riddler who is clearly deeply entwined with this story, and we're going to be seeing more of him, but his superficial interpretations, the look that they present him with, it's not as cool as the classy, iconic Riddler from the original design that we saw in Batman the Animated Series.
Yeah.
And you're right, like so much inspiration from Deadpool with breaking the fourth wall that I'm just like, okay, I'm really happy to see the Riddler do something cool for once in his life, but it really stinks to me that I'm also dealing with superficial elements that I don't overwhelmingly love.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But that's the opinion that I have, and I will own up to that.
No, but I don't think this is the thing we like to do on the show. Caleb and I don't shy away from the things that don't work. But part of the reason why they stick out so much that we might just ignore in a show we didn't care about so much is because that background is so tightly woven. These things jump out at us, right? The fact that Artemis uses a compound bow and they keep using both strings instead of one string just grates on me. And what's even worse is it jumps back and forth between episodes. Sometimes she uses one string, sometimes she uses them both. Clearly, whoever was animating that a particular episode knew how a compound bow works. So it's ridiculous. Like if I was watching an anime, I would just be like, well, nobody cares. Nobody in the production team cares that much to know, and that's okay. I'm just going to enjoy the show for what it is. But in this show, you make a show with 3+ archers in it and give her a compound bow on purpose, and it's used wrong the whole time. I don't know. Anyway.
No, I get that. Like one of the things that I think that people yell at fans about or like is sort of seen as a negative thing is nitpicking on particular details like that. And on the one hand, I think, yes, there are a lot of people who will issue complaints about whether they're movies, comic books, or cartoon series they are clearly not living in their own universe right now. They're clearly not paying attention to reality. And it's ridiculous to talk about what is realistic when you have a universe where people can fly around.
Sure.
However, I think you touched on something. It's attention to detail.
Yep.
It is, how lovingly are you crafting this? How much attention are you paying to the world that you've created? And if you've got some animators who are making her use a bow wrong, it's like, well, you've done so much work. Why don't you just do a little bit more?
Yeah, and in this case too, it's internal consistency. Like from a storytelling standpoint, I echo exactly what you just said, right? And from a storytelling standpoint, for me, it's internal consistency and believability. You tell me Superman can fly, and you tell me because he can fly because he's solar powered. Okay, as long as that remains the same the whole time, that I have no issue with that because you've established that as a reality of this thing I'm watching. Right? This is why it drives me nuts about shocking a flatline.
Oh, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know already, I'm a nurse. And anytime I see a character die and flatline and they grab paddles and they yell clear and then jumpstart them like a car battery, it drives me insane because that's not how it works in the world. And people are like, oh, but it's a show about the Flash. How can you argue about the realities of... No, it's medicine. Now you're telling me human bodies don't work the same in this entire universe. That doesn't... I mean, and all... It's so... it drives me nuts. But I have to let it go. I literally, a friend of mine who did some consulting who's a nurse who did some consulting on set in LA, and they literally told him to stop giving them advice because it's not a documentary, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, so I have to let some things go, but that doesn't mean it needs to be that way, right? Like it tells me how much you care for the detail, and it does pull me out of being able to suspend my disbelief with things like that. There's a difference between technobabble between a Heisenberg compensator in Star Trek, right? You tell me that, and you're like, okay, at least you put some thought into it and said, yeah, we know this couldn't possibly work, so we're just going to make up something and tell you.
We've got a compensator.
So we got a compensator for it. Great. Okay. At least you put some thought into it. When you're not even putting thought into it, it makes me wonder why I'm spending the time. Why am I taking my time to watch this? How have you become an unreliable storyteller to me?
It's like costuming for a stage play or even a movie for me. It's like, yeah, the actor's performance is not dramatically affected by how their costumes are put together. But if you put somebody in shabby, terrible-looking costumes versus really nice-looking costumes, it does affect your overall experience.
Yeah.
And I don't think it detracts from our love of the series at all that we have slight problems with the way different things are presented. But, we appreciate it when it's done right, I think is the big thing to take away. Is I love all of the characters who are approached with that beautiful, loving reverence that they paid to Sportsmaster.
Yes, exactly.
Conclude Part 1. Part 2, T-minus 7 days.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.